Okay, so I found a small bug in the script that did the skeletons from before, and so that's why they were too thick. I also added a simpler example to the slides because that example that we had was a bit too complicated, starting off with already a very difficult image. And so what we have here is just a very simple grid of points. And so here, when you go through this grid, if you use the cross neighborhood, so one above, one below, one to the left, one to the right, then you can do this junction labeling by just counting how many neighbors each one of these objects has. And so here you see that there are more than 2 neighbors, and so you keep that. Here there's only 1 neighbor, and so it's a terminal. Here there are 2 neighbors above and below, and so you call this a segment. And so that basically using these neighborhood tools, so like morphology and labeling that we've had before, we can do an analysis of this structure, assuming it's thin enough and ready to use. You can also use different neighborhoods to start to look at different values in this image. And so if you use a box neighborhood instead of a cross neighborhood, so the cross is just the one above, one below, the box would be including the diagonals as well, then you start to get sort of different values for what points are junctions and which points are not junctions. And so here you see that this gets called part of the junction as well, because this point diagonally touches that one. So this point has then 3 neighbors rather than just 1 neighbor. And so depending on what exactly you're trying to extract from your image, it can be useful to use both approaches. But this would be sort of the standard approach. And what's very nice about this is we can then quantify this very easily of how many segments are there by just finding all the points that are labeled as segments and then doing a connected component labeling, because we know all the individual segments won't be touching because there'll be a junction in between them. And so when you remove the junction points, you then have all the segments, and none of them should be connected that aren't connected normally. You can get rid of the terminals or count the number of terminals versus the number of junctions and start to look at those ratios to analyze the system. So then this is that image that we've had before where that bug is now fixed. And so you can see the points that are labeled as terminal, segment, junction, and then even, is that one off? I think that's one off. But anyways, so we have the different classifications of those images. We can then do the assessment where we count all the points that fall into the junction, segment, terminal category and start to analyze them in a number of different ways. And so it basically gives us a much better representation of our image for doing other post-processing steps with it. So now one of the very interesting things, particularly for chemists, is to look at something called tortuosity. And so one of the basic idea behind this parameter is that when you look at the arc length of a segment compared to the distance between its starting and ending points. And so this value, sort of tau, is that ratio. And so a high degree of tortuosity indicates that a network is convoluted and that the flow isn't going directly from point A to point B, and that this would tendentially predict that your flow rates would be much, much lower than in something that was a very straight shot. And so in geology, it's quite important for looking at sort of diffusion and fluid transport. And so in some of the projects we've looked at, like where you deposit radioactive waste, you use tortuosity as part of your model for how long does it take for this waste to get into the groundwater. And so if you have a very high degree of tortuosity, this can make it 1,000 times slower than if you had a very low degree. And so finding materials where that's very high can prevent that from sort of spreading or diffusing faster than it decays. Analytical chemistry. This is one of the very important things when you're doing things like chromatography and you want to be able to separate components by size. that you have a very tortuous structure and that you know small things can go through it much quicker than large things. And so this now gives you the ability to analyze that in the actual image itself so that you could potentially predict where this would come out. In vascular tissue, it can be then a sign of pathology. So if you have structures that are very sort of errant and not in a straight line, that can be a sign that maybe they grew too quickly or maybe they're being caused by some sort of disease process. So now to kind of go on beyond that, one of the other very useful tools that we cover is this idea of a thickness map. And so it's a metric for assessing the size of structure of objects in a very generic manner. And this is, for every point X in the image, you want to find the largest sphere which contains that point and is entirely contained within the object. And so the image here shows kind of a typical object, maybe a cell or something in 3D. And the sphere centered at point P with a radius R is the largest that fits in that region of the object. And so where it's very useful is sort of spherical or cylindrical-like objects because it gives you immediately their radius. And so if we looked at how some of the approaches before got the radius, they would take something like the volume, and if you multiply the volume by a factor and take the cube root, this is the radius if the object happened to be a perfect circle or a perfect sphere. But that is in many cases not true, and so this radius can be very misleading if you calculate it that way. Whereas with this radius, this is actually calculated from the image data, and we know at the very least that there is one sphere in your object that has that radius. This can then also be very useful for flow and diffusion because it can highlight bottlenecks in your structure. And so that when you look at points in kind of this part of the image, you would see that they are narrower than points in other parts of the image. And so that would show you that that region itself is sort of a bottleneck. And so if we take the thickness map, so we go back to our very simple cell object, and here was the distance map that we had before, we can then create a thickness map from it, which kind of greatly simplifies the map that we have. So that rather than having all the points at the border be 1, we have all the points inside an object that's mostly spherical being the same 3 radius. And so what that means is not that that's 3 away from the surface, but that there is a radius 3 circle that contains that point. And so that point isn't really a bottleneck for your structure, even though it's only 1 away from the surface, because that area around it is quite broad. Whereas this point here is 1 away from the surface, and the thickness is 1, which means that it is in fact a bottleneck, because there is no larger sphere or larger radius circle which contains that point, because it is right between these 2 objects. And so if you had some sort of diffusion process, it wouldn't be limited at any of these green points, but it would be very limited there. It would also be somewhat limited here, but we see that there's kind of 2 or 3 points of overlap there, depending on if you count diagonals or not. Whereas this one is really just 1 point where those cross. And so the thickness map gives us kind of a tool from taking this distance map that we had before and turning it into some more useful metrics to look at and useful images. You can also do this on the reverse space, so where you then take the thickness map around a cell. And what this can be very useful for is looking at how far apart objects are from each other. And so if we look at the distance map of the thickness map of just the cell itself, it tells us something about the shape of the cell and how large it is and where its bottlenecks are. And when you look at the thickness map of the opposite, so the background area, you can then start to see how the spacing of these objects are organized. I think there were better examples. Yeah, so that if we take this image, like the image we had before, so ignore the other information around it right now, you have this thickness map for your object. And if you had done the thickness map on the white areas here, it would have told you something about the radius of the sort of rods that you have going through this object. And when you do the thickness map on this area, it tells you something about kind of the spacing between them. We also see that for kind of our ideas that we had last time, where we were trying to look at this as sort of a network, that now all of these different regions are visually separated a little bit. So it's not a labeling yet, because all of these correspond to radii and not actually unique labels. But we've put our image in a much better form for potentially identifying these different areas or these different regions. So now one of the things that we cover is, with this thickness map, how does the skeleton fit into this? Or how do the distance map and the skeleton fit into this? Because as we talk about the idea for this, the sphere centered at the point P with the radius r is the largest one that fits in there. And while that's not the same definition as a distance map, it does sound quite similar. And so rather than going through the image at every point and trying to find the largest sphere inside your object that fits at that point, which is very, very, very time consuming, we can use the distance map and the skeleton to help us get to a much quicker response here. And so this is kind of what we cover here, is that actually the thickness map, or the skeleton that we have, is a good first approximation for what the thickness map should be. And so this skeleton, so these local maxima on our distance map, show us where those spheres are that have the largest radius in a given region, because they are the local maximum of the distances that we have. And so we know the distance map shows us at each point how far away you are from the boundary, and the skeleton then shows us this point here. And so when we look at this thickness map for this object, the center of the sphere corresponds to the local maximum of the distance map. And so that rather than searching through this image around every possible sphere that it contains that point, all you have to do are find the spheres along this skeleton maximum and use that to create your thickness map. Is that clear? Are there questions on that? Yeah, you can do this method iteratively, and then at some point you found all of the spheres. So if you go here and you take sort of these maximum values, you create all the spheres there. Normally you set some sort of under limit of, like, these are the smallest spheres you actually want to look for, otherwise it can take a very, very long time to compute. But you can go theoretically through every point where you haven't found a sphere radius that covers it yet, and try to find the spheres inside of it.
So first we take the global maximum, then you look for any maximum outside the sphere and making the sphere there?
Well, you start with the maximum, you then go sort of progressively down, but you find the local maximum. So that's where these skeletons come in useful, because the skeleton shows you those local maximum points. So when you have the distance map, you can find the local maximum values on it, so these ridges, and then create spheres from all those points. And then kind of go through what points haven't been covered by spheres already and fill those in until you filled in all of the points in your image. Or your sphere radius has gone down small enough that you don't really care anymore. Because like with this green point here, you'll never find a bigger sphere that contains that point, because there is no bigger sphere that contains that point. And so you ultimately won't get any larger than a radius 1 sphere. And so for an image like this, you would go all the way down, For other images, it would be less important. I mean, if we go to this image here, you know, a radius 1 sphere is kind of irrelevant for us. We don't really need that. We're not that concerned with it. The smallest bottleneck we'd expect would be 2 or 3 or 4 radius, and so those are the ones we'd really focus on making sure we get. Because even with this map, you know, at your edges or your borders, particularly if they're very edge-shaped, you're going to find regions which don't fit into any sphere particularly well, or single pixels which don't fit into a sphere particularly well. And what you have to have is some sort of model for, is this single point on a border actually relevant for what I'm doing, or is it not? You know that for this cell, this single point probably, you know, potentially is important if it's exchanging genetic material or splitting or doing something like that. But for a large, you know, if you were to have a single point here, that would potentially not be very relevant. Because it's not like there would be much flow, because that single point doesn't go anywhere. You know, it's just a single point. It's probably noise or air or something like that. And so it requires some understanding of what you're actually looking at to decide which things you include in your thickness map and which ones you don't. But you fundamentally start off with a distance map, and you iteratively go through it and replace all those pixels with spheres, or with the radius of the sphere. And yeah, so that we see that we can actually create thickness maps very quickly by using the skeleton, and by optimizing these approaches, you can get more and more efficient at actually generating this result. And that, you know, statistically, the difference between a thickness map and sort of an optimized algorithm for the thickness map is pretty small. And so it only really matters for some of these very, very small objects, which aren't necessarily even very interesting for us. And so you can use many of these algorithms, and actually in most tools, when you calculate thickness maps, they use an approximation rather than the full calculation. And so you should potentially be aware of where this can be very problematic. You know, if you were very concerned with single pixel boundaries, those are the kinds of things that get lost when you do these algorithms. But for most large 3D structures, it isn't much of a difference, and so it won't really affect you. Here we show cutting down even more quickly, and now we show kind of what it looks like in 3D. And so this is where you see how useful a thickness map can really be, and that we have on the left here an image of a foam where you can kind of see a little bit with, you know, the boundaries maybe of some of the bubbles. But it's very difficult to get much out of this image. It's quite noisy. There's lots of different holes inside of it. And so figuring out where the bubbles actually were is very difficult. And when you apply a thickness map, you now get a much nicer representation of what your object looks like. And so you get rid of all of those tiny little holes, and you now have a very sort of colorful representation where you see, okay, there's a few very large bubbles or large cavities that can be filled in. There's then a number of kind of smaller bubbles around that. And that this gives you a very good starting point for starting to visualize or analyze this data further. Whereas if you had all of these pixels, you know, you could never do a connected component labeling on all of those pixels because there's simply way too many of them. I mean, there's tons of holes, tons of little problems, tons of small artifacts that you would have a really difficult time getting rid of. But when you do a thickness map, you can then immediately see where are these larger objects and how are they sort of positioned relative to each other. And so these are the things that can make your life as a scientist trying to visualize things and then trying to quantify things massively easier. And so if you were interested here in the size distribution of the bubbles, you actually don't have to label all of the bubbles uniquely in order to come up with that size distribution. You can calculate that directly from the thickness map. And so that's where you can sort of take shortcuts or avoid doing complicated steps that aren't necessary if you know what your goals are and have the right tools available to you. Yeah?
It seems to shrink the objects always, because when there are two overlapping objects, it always separates them. Like there, this big red bubble, and right to the next, right to the right side, not the other side.
Yeah.
There, in the picture, it looks like they're overlapping.
Yeah. I mean, the picture is also very hard to see where they are. Potentially, I mean, we had before in this example where you had the overlapping regions here, that the overlapping region will tendentially be swallowed up by the larger region that it's contained within. And so if you were looking at what's the radius of this bubble, it would then be, it would still be correct because this radius was calculated from the largest sphere that fit inside. You're not actually subtracting any volume when you mark this with a larger radius. So that if you were to do the histogram of, you know, how much volume is at which radius, that histogram would then show you less volume for this sort of dark purple, because some of the dark purple is being taken up by a bubble that's even larger. So where the problem would come in would be as if you were trying to really quantify, this is how many bubbles we have that are this radius, and this is how many bubbles we have that are this radius. So if you were to try to reverse calculate that to how many bubbles, the number of bubbles, that would potentially not work very well. But when you're actually doing this labeling, you don't delete or remove or separate it. You just have, you know, that this bubble will kind of invade into pixels that you might have assigned to that bubble, depending on what rules you had. But here, the goal wasn't to assign all the pixels to a unique bubble. It was to kind of figure out how big your bubbles are and maybe approximately how many you have. And that by doing a thickness map, you get much, much closer with that to that without having to come up with the rules of if a voxel's right there, does it belong to this bubble or does it belong to that bubble? Because that's actually a very complicated rule to come up with. I mean, even when you understand the physics of these foams and you know things about sort of the curvature and how the interfaces should look, it's very complicated without knowing what this bubble is and what that bubble is and what your sort of liquid is between them, or surfactants are, to say which one that actually should belong to. And you have sort of the problem that once you've decided how big the bubbles are, then you can say which point this belongs to. But once you say which point this belongs to, you've then changed the size of the bubbles, and then you have to reapply those rules to figure out which ones it should belong to. And so a lot of these things can be very, very complicated to do, whereas a thickness map only requires that you assume this sort of basic spherical model, and it gives you this result kind of immediately. And even if your data are sort of noisy and have lots of problems in them, you still get something reasonable to start with. But yeah, I mean, to then try to take this and say, now we'll try to identify which ones of these pixels belong to which bubbles, is still a complicated task. It doesn't make that task any simpler, but it for many things allows you to completely skip that task. To say, actually, we're not concerned with where that boundary is, we're concerned with how big these pore spaces are. So the kind of last major topic we'll cover is this idea of watershed. And so if we go back to kind of this original distance map, we now have 3 different objects here. We could do a thickness map where we would then get 4 different circles. But that wouldn't necessarily help us separate these objects because you know, these two circles have exactly the same radius. And so if you were to group things together that had the same radius, you now have these two things in the same group. And you could do maybe a component labeling on that, or maybe one erosion to try to separate them, but you're still at a fairly complicated point where you're not breaking these objects apart. And so if your actual interest is to identify these as 4 different objects, you'll need another approach for that. And one of the ideas that was mentioned before was that you have, you know, maybe you can do a threshold, that you can say if we take all the values that are 1 or 2 or 3 away and keep them, then you can label all of those and then have a basis for re-identifying your objects. And you'll actually see this is exactly what we do in one of the data sets that we have. So we have here data sets. This finding bubbles in foam. And then if you go to kernels, finding bubbles with erosion. And so that's very similar to this threshold idea. And so here what we have is you have a foam object here. This is what it looks like. So this is very similar to the sample I showed before in the slides. You can then sort of erode all of the things, which is the same as making a distance map and taking the things that are a certain distance away. You now end up with these small little circles. You can then label them using component labeling like we talked about before, because now they're all identified as separate objects, and each one of these is now a different color. And then here you can regrow them, and so you can now use dilation to make the bubbles larger again. And then now you sort of have an image of what your bubbles look like. And so that works fairly well for analyzing the images. But if you have a mixture of larger and smaller objects, that can then be very tricky. Because now, you know, this object isn't quite 3 away from the surface. And this point, you know, if this point is the same distance as there, then you can't find a threshold that will divide these 2 bubbles, that won't divide these, that won't completely delete that bubble. And so if you have a completely sort of mono-disperse substance where everything has exactly the same radius, then erosion or threshold with a distance map works very, very well. But when you have things that have very different radii, it then becomes quite tricky because you can't separate them as well as you'd like to, and the rules don't work very well. And so that's where Watershed can be a very useful technique for this. And so the idea for Watershed is that you let water flow downhill. And so the idea comes from sort of topology or these other areas where you take your distance map that you've already calculated and you put water on each one of these pixels. So you put this sort of translucent pixel on top of it, and each one of those represents 1 unit of water. You then say, this water point can flow downhill. And so this distance here represents kind of maybe the distance from the surface. And so you see each one of these points as kind of like a, you know, if you look at it from on top, they're either a bunch of mountain peaks and the water's flowing uphill, or they're a bunch of valleys and the water's flowing downhill, whatever's easier for you to visualize. And that each one of these represents then kind of a cone that you have. And so you let each point of water move along the steepest downhill gradient from itself and collect at that point. And so if you see one iteration in, all of the water at the boundary is now gone, and it started to kind of get closer to the center. And so these are the points that have 1 water unit, the greens have 2, the blues have 3, the purples have 9. So the closer you are to the center, the more water collects there. You can then perform 2 steps And now you see that, you know, there's 25 here, 25 there, there's 10 or 5 points here, and then you can perform 6 steps or n steps until the water stops flowing, and you end up with just these 4 different points. And what you can see here is that no matter how small this object is or how big this object is, all of the water will flow to that local maximum or local minimum and never have any ability to flow in another direction. So that you can see for this point here, it always has to go this way. There's no circumstance where it would go that way. And so what Watershed gives us is kind of a very clearly defined region that this object then belongs to. And so now we've identified these 4 different objects, and we also know how much water is in each one of them. And so it makes it much easier to then try to reconstruct what belongs to that, because we sort of know what the area should be, or what the volume should be of that total object. So you can then reconstruct it, where you now have the center and the rate and the area, and you regrow all of those bubbles into separate regions. And so here it worked quite well, where you've now classified these 4 different bubbles into 4 different objects. For more complicated objects, you can do the same sort of thing. So here you see a number of objects there. You then calculate the distance map. You can then calculate a watershed. But with real images, you can then start to get these sort of artifacts where you have a point here where, because the distance map isn't steep enough there or has sort of a local minimum right at that point, you now have a region between these 2 bubbles which gets counted. And so this is called sort of over-segmentation. So you found too many regions or more regions than you wanted to find. But then what's good about this is if you under-segment, it's a problem, because then you have to figure out how to divide things up. If you over-segment, it actually isn't usually an issue, because all you have to do is come up with a rule for combining these segments together. And so when you have circumstances like this now enables you to say, I want to come up with a rule to assign this to this bubble or this bubble, and you assign it to the larger neighbor, or you assign it to the neighbor that's closest, or you assign it where they have the largest interface between them, or any number of other rules that you'd like to come up with that make sense for the samples that you're looking at. And so actually having something that divides your things up too much isn't a problem. It's only a problem if you haven't divided them up enough, because coming up with better rules to cut samples can be very tricky. So the last thing we'll briefly talk about, but we won't get into much, at least not in this lecture, is this idea of curvature. And so curvature is a very useful metric for surfaces and interfaces. If you think about it, kind of like in the mathematical definition or the initial shape definition or geometry definition, it's a very useful metric to have. And so if you have this curve here, you can define, rather than just a slope at every point, you can define the largest sort of sphere that fits inside of that. And so, or that fits inside of that part of the curve. And so that's kind of how you come up with this idea of curvature. And it's a little bit similar to the thickness map, but it's defined in a much different way. And so this is kind of a thickness map for the surface of your object. And so you have the curvature defined as sort of 1 over this radius. And so a low curvature means a very large radius, and a high curvature means a very small radius. And so one of the things you have in 3D for curvatures are this idea of kind of a surface normal. And so you take your 3D surface, or your 3D object, you create a surface out of it, and then you calculate all of the normals to this surface. So you have this n vector, and that's the point that at your surface sort of projects perpendicular to your surface at that point, outwards. And so for this object, you can see all of this, and this is sort of like hair coming out of all the points in the object. And so when you look at curvature, in 1D it was quite easy, you just had this, or 2D was quite easy, you just had 1 over r. In 3D, it's quite a bit more complicated. And so you don't just have the curvature at every point, you actually have a number of different curvatures at every point. And so if you look at the 2D definition of curvature, that worked very well for kind of a curve, because at one point in the curve, you can always define a circle that fits in it very well. For a 3D object, there's a lot of different ways this can look. And so if you think about a sphere, this is very easy, because no matter how you draw a plane in the object, you always get the same radius at the border. But if you think about an object like a saddle, so where you have it going up in one direction and down in the other direction, if you draw a plane this way, the curvature looks like it's going up in that direction. And if you draw a plane in it this way, the curvature is going in exactly the opposite direction. And so with 3D, it becomes much more difficult to actually define what curvature means, because there are so many different shapes that can fit inside of that. And so what you can define is that if you have sort of an angle theta, where it's a single plane that you rotate around this angle at the normal, you can define 2 principal curvatures. And so your principal curvatures are this K1, kappa 1, and kappa 2. And that would be the maximum curvature you have as you rotate this plane around, and the minimal curvature you have. And so with the saddle, the maximum would be sort of this positive value that you have here, and the minimum would be the negative value that you have in that 90-degree direction. You can then calculate this idea of mean curvature, where it's this 2 principal curvatures, sort of the average of them, or the Gaussian curvature, which is then the product of these 2 principal curvatures. And so if it's a sphere or a spherical inclusion, this will be positive. And what that means is that these 2 have the same side. And if it's negative, that would be sort of saddles or hyperboloid surfaces. And so that means the curvatures disagree in sign, that one of them's positive and one of them's negative. Or if it's a perfect plane, this would be then 0. Because if you have 0 in any direction, that means the curvature is completely flat, and that's then a plane. And so you can then project these curvatures back onto the surface itself. And so you can show for a surface what the curvature values are at different points. And so here we show the mean curvature, which is sort of the minimum, the average of the minimum and the maximum. And here we show the Gaussian curvature, where we have this product. And so we can see near the edges, we have these very, very high curvature regions, and kind of in the middle and some of these valleys, we have some of these negative curvature regions. And so this makes it then much easier to go through this object and start to analyze it, particularly if you were looking at some object that changes significantly in its structure. And so if you think about going from spherical particles that are sort of being melted or annealed together into kind of a mesh of balls, curvature would be a very useful metric for following this process, because it would be very difficult to find all of these spherical particles in one big blob at the end. And so to try to track them throughout the whole course would be very difficult, whereas looking at curvature would be very easy. And that once you go from a spherical particle to sort of this annealed mesh, there would be a pretty strong change in that curvature, and so following that would give you some idea of how the experiment's progressing. You can also then start to do things like characteristic shape, where you look at the distribution of these curvatures and start to analyze that in terms of what that means for your given object. And so if you look at how those distributions change, that can give you information on how your object itself is actually changing. So that rather than defining things like, this is an ellipsoid model and we want to see how well it fits, you can have your own model defined by these characteristic shapes, which you can then easily follow. And what's very useful with this is that it's independent of size. And so if you have an object that's growing, if you look at the other approaches that we've looked at, you have, thickness map or distance map, but those things are going to change as your object gets bigger. Whereas curvature, if you have a really strongly curved object or a really weakly curved object, that should be independent of the size. You have to scale by the radius, but everything else you can kind of keep as it was before. And so there you can see, as an object gets bigger, is it actually changing in the types of structures it has, or is it simply scaling? And that's the kinds of questions that you can start to answer with this. Unfortunately, most of these techniques get very complicated to use and are very specific in how you implement them. And so if you think about what steps you need to take in order to get to a curvature metric, it's lots of possibility for errors to come in. So that you first have to have your image of an object, you then have to filter it, process it, segment it, you then have to come up with a surface area model for what you're looking at. You then have to calculate the curvature from the surface area. And so these steps then kind of all propagate and multiply the errors that you have. And so at the end, you can end up with a very, very complicated processing chain with a huge amount of sensitivity to small changes in your data sets. So the take-home message is it can be a very useful tool, particularly for applying visual indications or scale-free metrics, or particularly for chemical experiments. There's a lot of problems that are very concerned with curvature. But it is very sensitive to your initial conditions and can be very complicated to implement. And so for a lot of tasks, it's not really ideal. And particularly if you have very noisy images, it amplifies that noise rather than reducing it. And so if we look at one of those, that foam example we had before, if you were to calculate the curvature on this structure, it would be almost completely meaningless. You would just have high, spiky values all over the place. You couldn't do anything with that at all. And so if you have very nice looking data, you can use tools like curvature to tell you something more about it. But if you have very noisy data, it amplifies all of those noises, because a single speck in a curvature in an image has sort of almost infinite curvature in every direction, whereas sort of large, smooth surfaces are what you're looking for in order to get meaningful values out of it. And so it's sort of the opposite of thickness in that sense, where thickness can take a very noisy image and turn it into something that's much easier to look at and interpret. Curvature can take a very nice looking image and turn it into something very noisy and difficult to interpret. Like this image that, we can see something's on there, but every small defect, every border, every edge has now been amplified. And so we need to come up with a way of getting rid of that before we can begin to actually focus on what's happening inside this structure. So there's also hundreds of other techniques. And so this was really just a beginning to show what sort of more advanced techniques are out there. And so this ranges from sort of Fourier analyses to tubeness or surfaceness, where you can then characterize similar to kind of curvature, but using a different underlying model. There's a lot of work with like fractal dimensionality. So if you have objects that look similar at different scales, you can start to quantify those things. For the really more advanced material science problems, you have these correlation functions that you can use, where you then have 2 or more point correlations, where you try to model a 2D or 3D structure in a correlated space, where you can then look at the consistencies or the changes in the structures as they're approximated by this correlation function. And so this tends to come up a lot in theoretical material science, where you're trying to build models for objects and predict how those objects will happen in will work in the real world, but you can also use this for taking image data and condensing it down into one of these correlation functions and then analyzing it as it's done in the theoretical world. It can also be very useful for looking at a number of different objects and seeing how similar they are, that rather than comparing all the pixels individually, you can just compare a fairly compact correlation function and see if that has changed or not. So that covers it. Are there any questions on that material? So for the exercises, we have the exercises from 9, which are more or less the same as last year, which cover the basics for all of these approaches. Where you can then use 9 with sort of Fiji macros, so like those thickness map, or like curvature, or some of these tubeness and other approaches. You can call that directly inside of 9 and have it run that way. And so in this one, we simulate data again so that we know what it's supposed to look like. We have this 3D blob simulator, and then we perform some analyses on it. And so we can perform a watershed analysis, we can perform a skeleton analysis, and start to quantify those into different groups and see how that looks. And so the last one is then kind of a curvature analysis where we calculate the curvature, again using an ImageJ plugin which does this. So you can look into this and see which ones of those techniques are relevant for you and that you're interested in. We then have alternatively the Kaggle data sets, which are potentially more interesting, where you have a street network from aerial images. And so this data set comes from the computer vision lab at EPFL. We've just prepared it as a Kaggle kernel. And so what you have here is sort of this overview. And you have these pictures of streets taken from an aerial or a satellite image. And you want to be able to identify where the roads are and how wide they are. And so this is a very common challenge. If you think about, for Google Maps, they have millions and millions of satellite pictures, but they don't have very much data about where roads are and how they're connected, particularly in developing countries or countries that don't have, Switzerland has a collection of all of these roads that they provide, and so that's very easy. But if you go to a country like Myanmar, they don't really have a local centralized database of all the roads. And so if you want to have maps in those countries, you need to automatically come up with ways of extracting those from the images. And so what we have here is kind of this set of ground truth, so you know where the roads should be. And in the exercises, we want to automatically segment that and use some of these skeleton approaches for trying to find the roads automatically. And so here we have kind of the starting point where you take your image, you take out one of the kind of color channels and you apply a threshold. And now we show kind of where the roads are that we want to extract from this threshold. And so we see that, a lot of the other objects in the image are the same color as roads. That's not always easy. But we can make a distance map. We can make skeletons, and maybe with the appropriate pruning and operations on these skeletons, we can then extract where the road actually is. And so this is what the distance map and the roads actually look like for all of these images, and the task is to kind of take that and improve it to find the roads more accurately. So that clearly the really big objects probably aren't roads, and so they can be removed. And then it's only really the small objects. And so if we're coming up with a good way of automatically finding those, it's potentially an interesting way to test it. For electron microscopy, you can do the same sort of thing, that you have all of these objects inside of your electron microscopy image, and you actually already know where these objects are, and that you can use a distance map and a skeleton to start to analyze those objects. And so here we can see sort of what the skeleton structures look like that we extract and what sort of pruning operations are necessary for identifying, how long is this object? How tortuous is that? Because, you know, the point between here and here is much shorter than the point between there and there. And so coming up with ways for analyzing that and making useful metrics is quite useful. And so we have both of those as kind of starting points in data sets that you can then expand to include more of the course topics if you're so inclined. And then finally, there's a ParaView curvature tool. For those of you, does anyone here use ParaView? Just one or two? Okay. So for those of you that use ParaView, you can use ParaView to make a lot of these analyses as well. And if you look at the slides that we have, the curvature graphs at the very end, we're all done in ParaView. So calculating the surface normals, calculating the curvature, projecting it onto the original image are all things that are very easy to do in ParaView. There are things that are much trickier to do in other tools, which is why we haven't included them. ParaView is then also very good because if you have really large image data sets, you can scale this across many different machines. And those are some of the ideas we'll get into more in sort of the big data and the larger scale lectures. So, if there's no questions on that, then you can get started with the exercises.